The widowed rancher found a dying healer on his porch. By nightfall, masked warriors arrived on horseback. The blood pooled beneath her body like spilled wine on weathered oak, seeping through the gaps between the porch boards where Thomas McCready had once carved his initials alongside his beloved Sarah's. The woman's breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale a whispered plea to a god who seemed to have turned his back on this forsaken corner of Montana territory. Thomas had discovered her at dawn, collapsed against his front door as if she had crawled there through the night, seeking sanctuary in the last place on earth where mercy might still exist. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and dried blood, her once white dress torn and stained with the evidence of violence that had pursued her across the endless prairie. The morning sun cast long shadows across the McCready ranch, illuminating the vast expanse of grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, their bells creating a gentle symphony that contrasted sharply with the woman's labored breathing. The air carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, a cruel reminder of the beauty that persisted even in the face of human brutality. Thomas knelt beside the stranger, his calloused hands hovering uncertainly above her broken form. At 53, he had seen enough death to recognize its approach, had watched it claim his wife during the bitter winter of 1874, when the doctor could not reach them through the snow. The woman's pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips like a trapped bird, weak but stubbornly persistent. Her eyes opened suddenly, startling him with their intensity. They were the color of summer storms, gray-green and filled with a desperate intelligence that spoke of secrets too dangerous to voice. She tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly before managing a single word that cut through the morning air like a blade. Please. The word carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a stirring of purpose he had not experienced since Sarah's death. He lifted the woman carefully, surprised by how light she felt, as if suffering had burned away everything unnecessary, leaving only the essential core of her being. Inside the ranch house, sunlight streamed through windows that Sarah had once adorned with cheerful curtains, now faded and gathering dust. The main room was sparse but clean, furnished with sturdy wooden furniture that Thomas had built with his own hands during the early years of their marriage. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with a single photograph of Sarah in her wedding dress, her smile frozen in time. He laid the woman on the sofa, covering her with a quilt that still carried his wife's scent after all these years. As he tended to her wounds with supplies from the kitchen, he studied her face. Despite the bruising and exhaustion, there was something regal about her features, a quiet dignity that spoke of breeding and education, uncommon in these parts. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the day, occasionally murmuring words in what sounded like Latin mixed with indigenous phrases Thomas could not understand. During her lucid moments, she would grasp his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes searching his face as if memorizing every line and scar. "They will come," she whispered during one such moment, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to pick up outside. "When darkness falls, they will come." Thomas had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the truth when he heard it. The woman's wounds were not the result of an accident or animal attack. The precise cuts on her arms, the deliberate bruising around her throat, the way she flinched whenever he moved too quickly, all spoke of human cruelty, of a violence that would not be satisfied until it had claimed its prize. As afternoon faded into evening, Thomas found himself checking and rechecking his weapons. His Henry rifle hung above the fireplace, fully loaded and ready. The Colt revolver his father had given him before the war rested in its holster on the kitchen table. He had not fired either in anger for years, but his hands remembered their weight, their promise of protection or destruction. The woman's fever broke just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that reminded Thomas of the fires that had consumed entire towns during his youth. She sat up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, as if testing the limits of her recovering strength. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said, her voice clearer now, touched with the hint of an accent that suggested Spanish ancestry mixed with something else, something older. "I am a curandera, a healer of bodies and souls." Thomas nodded, understanding flooding through him. He had heard stories of such women, practitioners of ancient arts that blended Spanish Catholic traditions with indigenous wisdom. They were sought after by those whom conventional medicine could not help. but they were also feared by those who saw their gifts as threats to established order. "What did you do to anger them?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Elena's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "I saved a child they wanted to die. A half-breed girl whose mixed blood made her an embarrassment to powerful men. They brought her to me broken and bleeding, expecting me to ease her passing. Instead, I healed her." The implications settled over Thomas like a shroud. In a territory where racial purity was often valued above human decency, Elena's act of mercy had marked her as an enemy of the established order. Men who built their power on the subjugation of others could not allow such defiance to go unpunished. "You should have let me die on your porch," Elena continued, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Now their anger will fall upon you as well." Thomas rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the prairie that had been his home for nearly 3 decades. In the distance he could see storm clouds gathering, their dark mass promising rain or worse. The wind carried the sound of approaching riders, still far off, but closing steadily. "I buried my wife in the ground behind this house," he said without turning around. "I planted a garden over her grave so that something beautiful might grow from the place where beauty died. Every morning for 5 years I have tended that garden, and every evening I have asked God why he took her from me." Elena remained silent, understanding that some confessions required no response. "Perhaps," Thomas continued, "he was preparing me for this moment. Perhaps Sarah's death taught me that some things are worth dying for, and some people are worth saving regardless of the cost." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the harsh voices of men who had ridden hard and far in pursuit of their quarry. Thomas could see them now, dark shapes moving across the prairie like a plague of locusts, their faces hidden behind bandanas, and their intentions written in the weapons they carried. Elena stood, her hand reaching for a leather pouch that hung from her belt. From within she produced a collection of herbs and small objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light in the gathering darkness. "If we are to face death together," she said, beginning to arrange the items in a careful pattern on the wooden floor, "then let us face it with power as well as courage." Thomas had never been a superstitious man, but as Elena began to chant in the ancient tongue of her people, he felt something shift in the air around them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the shadows grew deeper, more substantial, as if they were gathering strength for the confrontation to come. The riders reached the edge of his property as full darkness settled over the land. Thomas counted 12 of them, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold night air. They arranged themselves in a semicircle around the ranch house, their leader dismounting and walking slowly toward the porch. "McCready," the man called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Send out the witch, and we will leave you in peace." Thomas stepped onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms. The leader was a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes, well-dressed despite the long ride. Thomas recognized him as Judge Harrison Blackwood, a man whose influence stretched across 3 counties and whose word was law in matters both legal and personal. "Evening, Judge," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Afraid I cannot accommodate your request." Blackwood's laugh was as cold as January wind. "Do you know what that woman is, McCready? What abominations she practices in the name of medicine? She consorts with demons and poisons the minds of decent people with her heathen rituals." "What I know," Thomas answered, "is that she came to my door seeking help, and I will not turn away a soul in need." The judge's expression hardened, and he gestured to his men. They began to spread out, surrounding the house with practiced efficiency. These were not common cowboys or drifters. They moved with the precision of soldiers, their weapons held with the confidence of men who had used them before. "You are making a grave mistake, McCready. That woman killed 3 good men in town before she fled. She used her devil magic to turn their own blood against them, made them bleed from their eyes and ears until they died screaming." Thomas glanced back through the window, where Elena continued her ritual, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to match the beating of his own heart. He did not know if her magic was real, or merely the desperate hope of a frightened woman, but he could feel something building in the darkness around them, a presence that made the hair on his arms stand on end. "If those men died," Thomas said, raising his rifle, "I suspect it was not by magic, but by justice. Some sins carry their own punishment." Blackwood drew his pistol with the fluid motion of a gunfighter, and the night exploded into violence. Thomas dove behind the porch railing as bullets splintered the wood around him, the sound of gunfire echoing across the prairie like thunder. He returned fire methodically, each shot carefully aimed, drawing on skills he had hoped never to use again. Inside the house, Elena's chanting reached a crescendo, and Thomas felt the air itself begin to thicken and pulse with unseen energy. The attackers' horses began to rear and whinny in terror, their eyes rolling white in the darkness. Some of the men were thrown from their saddles while others struggled to control their mounts. A bullet grazed Thomas's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing against the front door. Through the pain, he could hear Elena calling his name, her voice urgent with concern. He forced himself to his feet, blood running down his arm, and stumbled back into the house. Elena stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of objects that seemed to pulse with their own light. Her arms were raised toward the ceiling, her face transformed by an otherworldly power that made her appear both terrible and beautiful. The very air around her seemed to ripple and bend, as if reality itself was responding to her will. "It is done," she said, her voice echoing with harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "They have called down judgment upon themselves, and judgment has answered." Outside, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by screams of terror and confusion. Thomas peered through the window and saw the attackers fleeing across the prairie, their horses galloping frantically into the darkness. Judge Blackwood lay motionless on the ground near his fallen horse, his silver hair gleaming in the moonlight. Elena collapsed to her knees, the effort of whatever she had accomplished draining the last of her strength. Thomas caught her before she could fall, holding her against his chest as she gasped for breath. "What did you do?" he asked, though he was not certain he wanted to know the answer. "I showed them the truth of their own hearts," she whispered. "Magic cannot create evil where none exists, but it can reveal the darkness that men carry within themselves. They saw their own sins made manifest, and their guilt consumed them from within." Thomas helped her to the sofa, then ventured outside to check on their attackers. Judge Blackwood was indeed dead, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The other men had fled so quickly that they had left behind weapons and supplies in their haste to escape. As dawn approached, Elena's strength began to return. She sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the prairie, her face peaceful for the first time since Thomas had found her on his porch. "Where will you go now?" he asked, knowing that she could not remain here, that other enemies would come seeking the woman who had defeated Judge Blackwood. "There are other children who need healing," she replied. "Other places where mercy is in short supply. The work continues, as it always has." Thomas nodded, understanding that their paths had crossed for a purpose larger than either of them could fully comprehend. He prepared supplies for her journey, filling saddlebags with food and medicine, ensuring that her horse was well rested and ready for the long road ahead. As Elena prepared to leave, she paused at Sarah's grave, kneeling among the flowers that Thomas tended so carefully. She placed her hands on the earth and spoke words in her ancient tongue, her voice soft and reverent. "What did you tell her?" Thomas asked when she rose. "I thanked her for sharing her husband with someone who needed him," Elena replied, "and I told her that love does not end with death, but transforms into something even more powerful." She mounted her horse as the morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Before riding away, she reached into her pouch and withdrew a small object, pressing it into Thomas's hand. "A gift," she said, "to remember that healing comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest magic is simply the courage to do what is right." Thomas watched her ride toward the horizon until she disappeared into the shimmering heat haze of the prairie. When he opened his hand, he found a small stone carved with symbols he did not recognize, warm to the touch and somehow comforting. He returned to his daily routine, tending his cattle and maintaining his ranch, but something had changed within him. The emptiness that had consumed him since Sarah's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose, a knowledge that his life still had meaning and value. Over the following weeks, travelers began to arrive at his door. Some were injured, others simply lost and seeking direction. All found welcome at the McCready Ranch, where a widowed rancher had learned that healing came not from magic herbs or ancient rituals, but from the simple act of opening one's heart to the suffering of others. The stone Elena had given him remained on his mantle beside Sarah's photograph, a reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single act of courage, a willingness to stand against darkness even when the odds seem impossible. In the evenings, as Thomas tended Sarah's garden, he would sometimes catch sight of riders on the distant horizon, their faces hidden by masks and their intentions written in the weapons they carried. But they never came closer, perhaps sensing that something had changed in this place, that forces beyond their understanding now protected those who sought sanctuary here. The prairie wind carried stories of a mysterious healer who appeared wherever suffering was greatest, bringing hope to the hopeless and justice to those who had been forgotten by the law. And in a small ranch house on the Montana frontier, a widowed man continued his quiet work of healing, knowing that love and courage could triumph over the darkest of intentions. The legacy of that terrible night lived on in the lives Elena had saved and would continue to save, in the courage Thomas had rediscovered, and in the understanding that sometimes the most powerful magic is the decision to stand with the innocent against those who would do them harm. Word spread quietly through the territory about the widow rancher, who had faced down Judge Blackwood and lived to tell about it. Travelers began arriving at his door with increasing frequency, some wounded by violence, others broken by loss, all seeking the sanctuary that Thomas McCready now offered without question. A young Mexican woman arrived 3 weeks after Elena's departure, her face swollen from beatings, her clothes torn and stained with blood. She spoke no English, but her tears needed no translation. Thomas tended her wounds with the same gentle care he had shown Elena, and when she was strong enough to travel, he provided her with supplies and directions to a convent in Santa Fe, where the sisters would protect her. An old Cheyenne warrior appeared at his door during a thunderstorm, carrying a fevered child in his arms. The man's eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned to expect hostility from white settlers, but desperation had driven him to seek help wherever it might be found. Thomas welcomed them both inside, using the herbs and remedies Elena had taught him during her brief stay. The child's fever broke before dawn, and the warrior departed with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, speaking words of gratitude in his native tongue. A former Confederate soldier, his left arm missing from the elbow down, stumbled onto the ranch during a blizzard. His eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much death, who carried the weight of battles fought for causes he no longer believed in. Thomas gave him shelter for the winter, and by spring, the man had found enough peace to continue his journey west, seeking redemption in the gold fields of California. Each visitor left something behind and took something with them. They left their pain, their fear, their desperate need for human kindness. They took with them hope, healing, and the knowledge that mercy still existed in a world that often seemed devoid of compassion. Thomas found himself changing with each encounter. The bitter loneliness that had consumed him since Sarah's death gradually gave way to a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. He was no longer just a rancher tending his cattle and mourning his wife. He had become something more, a keeper of sanctuary, a guardian of the wounded and lost. The stone Elena had given him seemed to pulse with warmth whenever he held it, as if it contained some fragment of her power. He began to understand that healing was not just about binding wounds or setting broken bones. It was about seeing the humanity in every person who crossed his threshold, regardless of their race, their past, or the circumstances that had brought them to his door. One autumn evening, as Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, he saw a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Elena rode toward him slowly, her posture betraying exhaustion, but her eyes bright with purpose. "I wondered if you would return," Thomas said as she dismounted, noting the new scars on her hands and the silver that had begun to thread through her dark hair. "I had to see what you had become," she replied, studying his face with those storm-colored eyes. "The stories reach even the distant places where I travel. They say a white rancher in Montana has become a haven for the desperate and dispossessed." Thomas helped her stable her horse, then invited her inside. The house looked different now, warmer somehow. Clean bandages and medical supplies occupied a prominent place on the kitchen table. A collection of gifts from grateful visitors adorned the mantel alongside Sarah's photograph, a Cheyenne prayer feather, a carved wooden cross from Mexico, a smooth river stone polished by countless hands. "You have found your calling," Elena observed, settling into the same chair where she had recovered from her wounds months earlier. "Perhaps," Thomas replied, pouring coffee for both of them. "Or perhaps it found me. Either way, I understand now why you saved that half-breed child, why you risked everything to heal someone the world had decided was worthless." Elena smiled, and for a moment, the weariness lifted from her features. The child lives and thrives with a family in Colorado. She speaks 3 languages now and shows signs of the gift herself. Healing begets healing, just as violence begets violence. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the prairie. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the grassland, their voices carrying ancient songs of survival and endurance. Thomas found himself thinking of all the souls who had passed through his door, each one leaving an invisible mark on his heart. "There is trouble coming," Elena said eventually, her voice heavy with foreknowledge. "Men like Blackwood do not die without leaving others to carry on their work. His son has been gathering support in the territorial capital, calling for laws to restrict the movement of healers and those who shelter them." Thomas nodded, having heard whispers of such legislation during his trips to town for supplies. Fear and prejudice were powerful forces, and they rarely stayed buried for long. "Let them come," he said quietly. "This land has room enough for all who seek peace, and I will not turn away those who need sanctuary." Elena reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with her own. "You have become what I always hoped to be but never quite achieved. A healer without conditions, a sanctuary without walls. Sarah would be proud." The mention of his wife's name no longer brought the sharp stab of grief it once had. Instead, Thomas felt a warm sense of connection, as if Sarah's spirit had found a way to continue her work of nurturing and caring through his newfound purpose. Elena departed the next morning, but not before teaching Thomas several new healing techniques and leaving him with a supply of rare herbs gathered from distant mountains. As she rode away, she called back over her shoulder, "Remember, healing is not about saving everyone. It is about being present for those who cross your path, about offering hope where despair has taken root." Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a steady stream of travelers seeking shelter from the storms. Thomas found his home filled with an ever-changing collection of refugees from violence, poverty, and persecution, a family of Irish immigrants fleeing famine, a freed slave searching for relatives sold south before the war, a tubercular preacher whose congregation had cast him out when his illness became apparent. Each person brought their own story, their own pain, their own desperate need for human compassion. Thomas listened to them all, tended their wounds, both physical and spiritual, and sent them on their way with whatever supplies he could spare and directions to others who might help them continue their journeys. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now resonated with the sounds of life. Children's laughter mixed with adult conversations in 6 languages. The kitchen fire burned constantly, providing warmth and light for whoever needed it. Sarah's garden, now expanded to 3 times its original size, provided vegetables and herbs for the endless stream of hungry mouths. Spring brought news that Elena had been right about the coming trouble. The territorial legislature had passed the Healer Registration Act, requiring all practitioners of non-traditional medicine to register with local authorities and submit to regular inspections. Those who sheltered unregistered healers faced hefty fines and possible imprisonment. Thomas received an official visit from the new territorial marshal, a thin man with cold eyes and an officious manner. Marshal Thornton arrived with 2 deputies and a stack of legal documents, clearly expecting to intimidate the rancher into compliance. "McCready," the marshal said, dismounting and approaching the porch where Thomas waited, "I trust you are aware of the new regulations regarding the harboring of illegal medical practitioners." "I am aware," Thomas replied evenly, his hand resting casually on the handle of his holstered revolver. "Then you will understand that we need to search these premises and document any evidence of such activities. The territorial government takes these matters very seriously." Thomas stepped forward, his presence somehow filling the space between them despite his calm demeanor. "Marshal, you are welcome to look around all you like. What you will find is a man offering food and shelter to travelers, as has been the custom on this frontier since the first pioneers arrived. If that is now illegal, then the territory has lost its way." The search revealed nothing more than what Thomas had described: supplies for treating common ailments, food stores sufficient for feeding unexpected guests, and sleeping arrangements that could accommodate several families at once. The marshal found no evidence of Elena or any other unregistered healer, no mysterious potions or forbidden rituals. "Do not think this ends here, McCready," Thornton warned as he prepared to leave. "We will be watching you. One step out of line, and you will find yourself in chains." "Marshal," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced death and emerged stronger, "I have buried my wife, survived Indian raids, and stared down men who would murder an innocent woman for the crime of healing the sick. Your threats hold no terror for me. After the lawmen departed, Thomas stood alone on his porch, watching them disappear into the distance. He understood that his quiet work had entered a new phase, one that would require even more courage and cunning than before. But he also understood that some fights were worth having, some stands worth taking, regardless of the personal cost. The masked riders never returned. Some said they fled to distant territories carrying their guilt like brands upon their souls. Others whispered that Elena's magic had shown them truths too terrible to bear. Thomas continued welcoming lost souls to his door, each carrying wounds that needed tending. The stone Elena had given him remained warm against his palm each evening as he worked Sarah's garden, a reminder that healing comes in many forms. On quiet nights, when wind howled across the Montana prairie, he would touch the carved stone and remember when mercy and magic walked hand in hand. Two broken souls had discovered that some wounds can only be healed by the courage to heal others. The blood had long since been scrubbed from his porch boards, but the memory remained. In choosing to stand against the darkness, Thomas had found his purpose again. Elena had found strength to continue her sacred work across the endless frontier. Years later, travelers found Thomas dead in his sleep, the stone clutched in his weathered hand. They buried him beside Sarah in the garden he had tended so faithfully. As earth covered his coffin, witnesses swore the flowers bloomed brighter than ever before. The prairie wind still carries stories of a mysterious healer who appears wherever suffering is greatest, and in a small ranch house where mercy once triumphed over malice. The legacy lives on in every soul brave enough to open their door to a stranger in need.